Welcome back to all those who came yesterday, and welcome to anybody who has arrived today. Don't be disappointed, Carolyn will arrive shortly. But I've been asked if I could begin the seminar this morning by having a look at Carolyn's introduction to the Documenta Book of Books, the book in which all the essays that were commissioned for Documenta were collected. It's in the reader, if everybody had a reader yesterday. For those who haven't, we've got some copies, hopefully. So yesterday, just to recap, Carolyn introduced the brain as the collection of objects in Documenta which were collected together in lieu of a concept. Okay, so she really did start with materiality, matter, and mattering. We then went on to read, I can never remember the name of this, On Touching, the Karen Barad piece, The Inhuman That Therefore I Am. And today I think Carolyn is going to return to the brain and tell us a few stories about the process of putting Documenta together, the other places apart from Castle that Documenta took place in. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do today is do a close reading, as we did with the Karen Barad yesterday, of this opening essay, because it really sets the project in place. Okay? So maybe I'll start reading and we'll do as we did yesterday, think about the text as we go along. That would be good. Okay, so the essay begins with a quotation. The dance was lively, the dance was very frenetic, lively, rattling, clanging, rolling, contorted, and lasted for a long time. Okay, so we were talking a little bit about choreography yesterday, choreography and movement. So she starts, to see from the point of view of the meteorite, which we were also talking about yesterday. The riddle of art is that we do not know what it is until it is no longer that which it was. Okay. Furthermore, art is defined as much by what it is as by what it is not, by what it does or can do as by what it does not or cannot do. It is defined even by what it fails to achieve. Okay. Any comments on that opening sentence? Quite a complex one if you're putting together an art exhibition. A really big definition of art, a big and open definition of art. One of the projects that did not come to fulfilment in Documenta 13 is the proposal to bring the second largest meteorite in the world, called El Chaco, from the north of Argentina to a spot in front of the Fridericianum in Kassel, not far from Walter de Maria's invisible yet present 1977 vertical Earth kilometre for 100 days. Now, we saw the controversy that surrounded that proposal yesterday with the question of what would the meteorite have liked. It didn't ever manage to come to Kassel. Okay, but that was one of the questions we looked at yesterday. This proposal, made by the artist Guillermo Fevoric and Nicholas Goldberg, was unexpected and rubbed up against our sense of being emplaced in the advanced digital age. Okay, so this was a very material object, which was to arrive in the world, in a world that, in which knowledge really circulates digitally more than in any other way. Okay. It probably would have been the heaviest single object to have ever in history been transported by humans from one point in the southern hemisphere of our planet to a distant point in the northern hemisphere, where it was intended to become a temporary point of reference and mediation on objecthood, time and place. Although, compared with its weight of 37 tons, rather small in size, about 240 by 220 by 200 centimetres, it could have functioned as a gigantic transitional object. And remember, we touched upon Melanie Klein and the notion of art as a transitional object yesterday. Temporarily shared by many people for the moment of its exhibition. This 37-ton rock, an object much older than Earth, because it didn't come from Earth, a tiny fragment from a large meteor that collided with the Earth's atmosphere and shattered into many fragments or meteorites, had come from much farther away in the universe and had fallen onto our planet thousands of years ago, pulled by gravity, sinking under the surface where it remained, creating an energy field above ground caused by the density of pure iron core present in its materials, until it was excavated in the 20th century and left above ground, naked, to the elements in a park near the town of Gancedo. Anybody know what the proper pronunciation of that is? Anybody speaks Spanish? No.
Yeah, but you said it well. Gancedo.
Gancedo, okay. The project ran up against the opposition of some anthropologists and various members of the Mukwit indigenous community, who, as traditional custodians, did not all agree on its loan. Some felt that where nature had positioned the meteorite, there it should stay forever, according to a view of natural and cultural heritage and patrimonial rights. The opponents were surely also motivated by other valid social and political struggles, the fraught and violent history of the past, generalised theft of indigenous lives, lands and cultures during the colonial period and up to today in many parts of the world. Certain very legitimate rights conflicted with the imagination of the temporary togetherness that the meteorite in Kassel intended to create, and the project of shipping the meteorite to Kassel for Documenta was interrupted both by the artists and by Documenta, whose aspirations were not those of dividing people, but rather of bringing people together through this object. Okay, so in a sense, Documenta, the very beginnings of Documenta, is a material object, is materiality, is stuff, is matter. It's the very beginning of the essay, the very beginning of Documenta. And what if, we asked ourselves, beyond this irresolvable contradiction, was it to see things from the position of the meteorite? Again, giving matter agency. It had travelled through vertiginous space before landing on Earth and settling. Would it have wished to go on this further journey? Does it have any rights? And if so, how can they be exercised? Can it ask to be buried again, as some of the Mukwit argued, or would it have enjoyed a short trip to an art exhibition rather than to a science world's fair? Okay, so that's a question of categories. Okay, the meteorite traditionally or conventionally would belong in a science museum. Okay, so what would it be also to change its categorical placement and bring it into art, which was Carolyn talking about yesterday. Remember the body on the roof that she found in Rome? Okay, nobody had known where to put it, so it stayed on the roof because there was no sort of category in which it could be placed. Okay, which made it a very strange object in the way that the meteorite in Kassel would have been quite a strange object, although in the environment of art today and what artists do, it may not have been as strange as it might have been 20 years ago. Okay, I suggest. What shift in its inner life would its being emplaced temporarily in Kassel have brought, being in one place, Kassel, and not in another place, for example, Argentina? What is this displaced position, generated by the perception of a simultaneous being in different spaces, where the collapse of time and distance provokes a new sense of what it means to be always in one place and not in another? The meteorite on Earth is, by definition, arrested motion through space. Okay, that's a lovely way of thinking about the fact that materiality is not inert stuff. Okay, in a sense, a meteorite in Earth is by definition arrested motion through space. It is what remains of a collision. What kind of collision does this proposed motion to Kassel and the arrest of that motion by the claims of place produced for Documenta? What kind of cosmic dust links Argentina and Kassel in this collision of absence or absent collision? Okay, so everything, I think, the very mode of Documenta is articulated in this kind of, we were talking about poetics yesterday, this very material description of a process and a desire to have this object in Kassel, which wasn't possible for one reason or another. But in a sense, it's generated a text that allows us to think about many of the themes that we will see held in the brain and in documentary in general. Okay, so actually as a piece of writing, it's a beautiful way to set a scene, okay, for the show. Okay, so we'll go on to the segment 2 in 10. Any questions though? We were all really silent yesterday, so I wondered if there was any thoughts, because this actually goes straight on from where we ended yesterday. Any thoughts or reactions to the text? No? Too early? Pre-coffee? Okay. Oh, we'll go on then. Okay. To intend. Documenter is a state of mind. Now, does Caroline mean documenter in general? The very exhibition documenter in general is a state of mind. It is, in fact, because it isn't an institution as such. It has to be set up every single time it's staged in Castle. The administrative environment for it has to be set up from scratch, so it doesn't exist as an institution.
So are the people who do that, are they, temporarily doing that, or do they do that for all documenters?
Well, they're there for the length of the 100 days, or the run-up to Documenta.
But they don't span different documenters?
No, not at all. It's a new team for every documenter, and it's set up from scratch. That's what's so different about it, okay? And allows you to be very creative about it, but it makes it very precarious, as one of the things that Caroline was talking about yesterday, was the precariousness not only of the art, but of documentary itself, because if the German government decides not to fund it, or you can't raise your funding, then it won't exist, okay? So it is a state of mind. It's a state of mind in the head of every curator who is chosen to run the project. And, there's a 5-year run-up to Documenta. So in one sense, you've got lots of time, but you haven't got a lot of time if you're setting something up from scratch, and you have to fund it, collect your artists together.
Can I ask if you know how a director and a team are appointed then? How does that... Where do they come
I
from?
don't, and you're going to have to ask Caroline that. I know how it was done for the previous
this.
document, but I don't know how it was done this time, because it may not be the same.
Right.
So it's a good question, though, because I think, precariousness, actual precariousness for Documenta as a thing that happens every 5 years is at the very heart of the project, anyway. Okay, so... It's very small, this text, even with my glasses on, it's a real test. Okay, so Documenta is a state of mind. Its history is different from other international exhibitions of contemporary art, mainly because it did not emerge from the 19th century trade fairs or world fairs of the colonial period, bringing to the old European centre the marvels of the world, like Venice, obviously, at the oldest temporary art exhibition in Europe. It emerged instead after World War II, which we saw yesterday, out of trauma, and within a space where collapse and recovery were articulated. So we looked at Arnold Bode's first Documenta yesterday and how that came about. It emerged at the juncture where art is felt to be of the utmost importance as an international language and world of shared ideals and hopes, as well as the most useless of all possible activities, in a state of autonomy, it was argued, during modernism. Okay, so we all know the modernist story of art being the place from which one can think because it is an autonomous space. Okay, it's risky. The artist has to find a way of living to make art. That's the modernist story, anyway. Okay, that was the modernist argument. Okay, so this is a movement that is explored in the choreography of Documenta 13. Most recent uses of the term choreography, etymologically the writing of a script for the sequence performed by a chorus of singers and dancers coming and going on stage, are connected with forms of harmony, found relations, participating together. Notions of self-choreography and improvisation became predominant in the choreographic imagination of the 1990s, dancing together to find new forms of agreement and democratic aesthetics. However, the notion of a harmonious syncing of people through a set of relations also repeats the false and stereotypical views of the harmonious syncing of bodies in productive economies during globalization, putting people in different places to work efficiently through the apparent improvisations achieved with smartphones and other digital technologies. Okay, so there's these two sides to this notion of choreography. One is that people are, one comes from dancing, that people are acting together to perform something that is a collaboration. The other is choreography of labour, the global choreography of labour, and labour that is precarious, contractual labour, short contractual labour, or no contracts whatsoever. Okay, and that's a global choreography of labour in the digital age. So we have these two ideas of movement and association choreography, but very different ones, circulating together in the world, the contemporary world, the present world. The choreography of Documenta 13 is instead unharmonic and frenetic, hence the quote at the beginning of the text, while also producing some shared understanding of this condition through alternative alliances and bonds. The appearance of movements and positions in different places does not suggest that we dance together in utopia. Rather, this choreography relies on a spatial turn, displacedness, a contorted interplay of movements in several places that cannot ever really be synced, that cannot ever be global, and the participants in and visitors to Documenta 13 are not encouraged to feel that they are everywhere at the same time, simultaneously experiencing life together in a synchronized manner. And nobody could ever do that anyway. When you think of the conditions of visiting an international exhibition, you're usually in a rush and you can't afford it, so you've got 2 days to look around, even Castle. Okay. Now, what if you wanted to go to Kabul or Alexandria or Cairo or Banff, any of the other places in which Documenta was situated in its various forms? Okay, it would be impossible to do. Okay, so in a sense, it's this sense of displacedness, because you're always wondering what it would have been like to go to Kabul or Cairo when you're actually in Kassel, which is one of the other things that I always think about. I mean, you always think, are you missing something? Am I only seeing a partial element of this? And what does partial mean in that sense? Okay, because we're always experiencing partial aspects of things. Okay, and rather than that being a disappointment, it's very interesting to think about what that means. What that means for a curator to in a sense, dare to put together this structure in which it's already known that most of the visitors will not be able to see the other aspects of it. So how do they come to Kassel, okay, which is the main place where people experience Documenta. Okay, so the problems of today are primarily those of the acute and growing difference between the wealthy and the poor in the world in the early 21st century, the subjugation of economy, society, and nature to financial systems interconnected with advances in computing power rather than with the production of material goods, and with the problems and consequences of a conservative notion of patrimony. That cultural heritage is specifically mine and cannot be shared or merged in a way with that of others. Okay. There was a debate this morning about the fear of Bulgarians coming to claim national social security in Britain. Did anybody hear that on the news this morning? There's now a panic about how long you will have to stay in the country before you can claim social services in Britain. Okay, so this fear, this thing about patrimony and who's entitled to what, where, I think is really interesting. Well, interesting, I mean, it's a matter of living or dying in most places. Okay, so the technology that allows for this critical situation is the digital, and the time that characterizes it is speed and simultaneity and short attention spans. Very interesting. Anybody who's teaching at the moment will have to deal with short attention spans. How do we get people to read a text like this? Interestingly, I've taught this text to studio students in fine art in little chunks, and we've done it as a dialogue, and we've done it as a performance, and we've done it in all sorts of ways. So the very density of it is opened up. Okay, so it's very interesting in what does one do with this very text in order to, in some way, make it hospitable to younger people whose environment is the digital and whose attention span is extremely short. And that's quite a test now for us to do that. It makes me feel ancient always. Okay. But Documenta 13 is nonetheless not organised around any attempt to read historical conditions through art. Okay, so it's not this question of a symptomatic reading of art, in a sense, to use a psychoanalytical approach, or the ways in which art's languages and materials might represent these historical conditions. Okay, so it's not in a sense a social history of art. Rather, it looks at moments of trauma. Okay, so it may be psychoanalytical. It looks at moments of trauma, at turning points, accidents, catastrophes, crises, events that mark moments when the world changes. So that's really interesting. So it's about events that mark moments when the world changes. And it looks at them insofar as they are moments when relations intersect with things. Now, relations intersecting with things, for me, brings back the images of the ruins of Castle yesterday and Carolyn's meditation on dust. Okay, when relations intersect with things, when relations intersect with matter. Moments when matter, oh, she just said it, when moments when matter come to matter, as they do in the Chaco meteorite. Therefore, participants in Documenta 13 come from a range of fields of activity. So not just art, they come from a range of fields of activity. They come mostly from art, but also from science, including physics and biology, eco-architecture and organic agriculture, renewable energy research, philosophy, anthropology, economic and political theory, language and literature studies, including fiction and poetry. Okay, all these contributions were commissioned, and the little booklets came out during the run-up to Documenta, and then they were all gathered together in the Book of Books, which we haven't got a copy of. So they're all collected there for you to read. And they are very different. The pieces are very, very different. They contribute to the space of Documenta 13 that aims to explore how different forms of knowledge lie at the heart of the active exercise of reimagining the world. Okay, so this, in a sense, was one of the aims of Documenta, to prompt us to reimagine the world. What these participants do and what they exhibit, in inverted commas, in Documenta may or may not be art. However, their acts, gestures, thoughts and knowledges produce and are produced by circumstances that are readable by art, aspects that art can cope with and absorb. Now that's difficult. Let's go back. What these participants do and what they exhibit in Documenta 13 may or may not be art. Okay, if you think of Ziegler's, the physicist that Carolyn worked with, she had one of his technical apparatus in the exhibition. I don't know what it was, but it was this amazing piece of equipment that was about the length of this table, which was in a room with various forms of art, little drawings of apples that had been made by a horticulturist in one of the concentration camps in Germany. All sorts of different kinds of presentations and representations of engagements with the world were put together, including the scientific ones. Okay, and it didn't seem strange to see that machine there. You know, again, probably because we're used to seeing non-art objects in art exhibitions anyway these days. So it wasn't, it wasn't that strange to anybody who is familiar with contemporary art, but it was quite a move for Documenta. Okay. However, their acts, gestures, thoughts and knowledges produced by circumstances are readable by art, aspects that art can cope with and absorb. So if you think about the physics we were looking at yesterday, Griselda mentioned that one could think about it as a form of poetics, or it was analogous to a form of poetics in a way. That might be our only access to it as non-physicists. So in a way, that's an artistic approach to physics. We can only think about it from where we are, but it's not impossible for an artist to think about, apart from the mathematics. I mean, you know, it would be impossible, I will put it to you, for anybody to understand those physics from the mathematical formulations. I've seen them on the page, and it's just gobbledygook unless you know the language. But when the language is translated into a literary form or a written form, you can enter it because you recognize the kind of movements that we were talking about yesterday amongst particles, and the kind of associations and relationships between matter and non-matter that are the process of art making as well. Okay, so it's not impossible to think it through physics, those two things. So, you know, that Documenta was an environment in which you could think about how quantum physics has changed our thinking about the world, I guess. Okay. Okay. Thoughts and noises are produced by circumstances are readable about aspects that art can cope with and absorb. The boundary between what is art and what is not becomes less important. Documenta 13 is indeed dedicated to artistic research and forms of imagination that explore commitment, matter, things, embodiment, and active life in connection with, yet not subordinated to, theory and epistemological enclosures. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. Commitment, matter, things, embodiment, and active life in connection with, yet not subordinated to, theory and epistemological enclosures. Is that okay?
Could you explain a bit on the epistemological
Okay, the ways of meaning, okay, systems of meaning that are self-sufficient and enclosed. Okay, so if you think about linguistics as a systems of meaning, or or quantum physics as a system of meaning. Yeah. Okay, it is a system. Okay, and there's an inside and an outside to it because it has to hold together as a system. Okay, but there are spaces where actually it can't be enclosed. It thinks it's enclosed, but it's not. Okay, so in a sense it's leaking. It's leaky, as we were talking about yesterday. These things, these structures are leaky, and where they leak, they're kind of amenable to mixing, in a sense. Okay. So as mentioned in the beginning of this volume, Documenta 13 is driven by a holistic and non-logocentric vision that is shared with and that recognises the knowledges of animate and inanimate makers of the world, inanimate workers of the world. That's why it's non-logocentric, in one sense. I mean, it's a very, very interesting piece by Pierre Huyghe, which was the sculpture with the bees, in which there was a nest of bees as the head, okay, and the bees made their honeycomb throughout the run-up to Documenta. So you had this amazing... Did you see that, Brenda? No, you have an amazing sculpture of a woman, actually. Really open to feminist interpretation, this piece, mind you. And then the head was living, okay? It was a nest of bees. And it was in a garden that was also a kind of compost heap that he'd made this environment out of in the Our Park in Kassel, which is a Baroque formal garden. But it has these little pockets, okay, where, the gardeners put their compost, and I don't know what else happens, but he'd made this extraordinary space in which there was this sculpture, okay, traditional sculpture, traditional kind of almost classical sculpture, with this extraordinary live beehive with the bees moving about. Okay, so in a sense, that certainly isn't logocentric in any sense or form. Like, how do you even describe it? How do you describe that piece? If you were doing a kind of thick description of that piece, how would you start? Okay, aware that it's about non-logocentrism. So do you just leave it alone, or what do you do? Okay, so it poses really, really interesting questions all the time. Okay, as mentioned in the beginning of this volume, Documenta is driven by a holistic and non-logocentric vision that is shared with and that recognises the knowledges of animate and inanimate makers of the world. The attempt is not to put human thought hierarchically above the ability of other species and things to think or produce knowledge. This does not mean that we are always able to access these other knowledges through scientists and in particular quantum physics, although scientists and in particular quantum physics do attempt to learn them, how, for example, photons dance and think together. And that's what we were talking about yesterday through the Karen Barad essay. But it gives a special perspective onto our own thinking. It makes us more humble, able to see the partiality of human agency, encouraging a point of view that is less anthropocentric. It is important that today an alliance is forged between, on the one hand, progressive social thought, traditionally anthropocentric, due to its engagements with the social, economic justice in human communities, and on the other, the current legacy of ecological perspectives. And that's kind of where we ended yesterday about, where can strawberries vote? How do we allow some kind of worldly agency to things that are not human, and how are they represented in a democracy? That conversation we ended up with yesterday. Were you here yesterday? Well, that was very interesting. Okay, we got through a lot of things yesterday, but that was one of the, because Caroline in an interview, I think it was Switzerland, she said yesterday, there'd been this great news that she'd obviously said something about this concern of hers, and it had been headlined in the newspapers as Director of Documenta 13 asks, can strawberries vote? And of course they thought she was completely mad. There was a lot of worry about Caroline's directorship of Documenta before it happened because of these kind of approaches, it has to be said. Okay. So, and also she didn't make the concept known before the event. It was right up to the opening of Documenta. So it's a very, very brave project, actually. Really brave project. So feminism in the 1970s articulated the notion that the private sphere was not separate from the public sphere, and that in that private world lay the fault line of politics. So in a sense, it is a deeply, deeply feminist documenta, it has to be said. In structurally feminist. It doesn't mean it's full of, representatives of 70s feminism or whatever. It's structurally absolutely feminist in its politics. So feminism in the 1970s articulated the notion that the private sphere was not separate from the public sphere, and that in the private world lay a fault line of politics. It worked through questions of othering. Okay, so that's at the root of feminism. Masculinity, femininity, the relationship between the dominant and the other. Okay. At times in antagonism with leftist intellectual groups that prefer to discuss politics only in terms of class struggle and the sphere of production. There was one argument that feminism actually weakened the Marxist line of class struggle because it introduced something that weakened the struggle, the class struggle. Okay. It was a distraction, to use one of Caroline's phrases from yesterday. It was a distraction from the Marxist class struggle. Okay. That was a big debate. Time proved that the biopolitical fault line was indeed an essential terrain of contestation. Time proved that the biopolitical fault line was indeed an essential terrain of contestation. So women's bodies, which were always at the centre of feminism. If you think of, the debate about other than human forms of reproduction, okay, at the moment. And that our innermost subjectivity, both physical and mental, had become the space of colonization, down to the smallest gene. Okay, so the struggle for women's control over their own bodies, around the abortion debates, has actually now become the struggle of the world to have its own rights, the very world, okay, in terms of biotechnology, the biotechnological production of food, for instance, and animals for food production, artificial insemination. Okay, so today, following Donna Haraway and other thinkers, that fault line seems to have shifted once again. The emancipatory potential for thinking in new ways without producing constituted knowledge that is instrumental and easily transformed into negotiable investments could lie in an accord between human and the mainly non-human intelligences, affects and beliefs, emotions and forms of trust that can be established among all the life forms on the planet. This does not indicate less interest in humanity and people, their lives and cultures, their art and imaginations. It is based instead on the principle that more potential lies in becoming with than in mistrust, fear and competition over resources and possibilities. Okay, any thoughts about that? Yep, go for it.
It doesn't necessarily, like, it seems like something in principle that makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily, like, there are implications of flattening out all of humanity. I'm just thinking of the different indigenous groups who were, you know, had different vested interests and positions in relation to the meteorite.
Absolutely.
And I don't know what happens to all of their, you know, that kind of dissent.
So you mean the different cultural positions in relation to both the world and people, okay, that come from different cultures, and you're saying that this is a Western flattening of the possibilities of other positions.
Maybe a Western flattening, maybe, but maybe that's something that is problematic for indigenous perspectives. But
Okay.
I'm not indigenous, so I can't speak for.
Yeah, I mean,
for anyone else.
it is always difficult in these situations because none of us usually are indigenous. I mean, you know, we are in a sense speaking from one position, which is, you know, the one we know.
Oh, right, okay, but not all the same.
But not all the same. Yep, Brenda.
I guess this depends on your understanding of becoming with, right? If you put a lot of stress on the with, it's probably less of a flattening, I assume, you know, because there's this ethical implication, I guess, of, you know, showing respect to the other, as you know, we talked about this yesterday, within yourself, but also within maybe, you know, other populations, indigenous cultures, what have you, and it's exactly not this fight against, or, you know, because of a lack of resources, or, you know, capitalist kind of, you know, issues and desires. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, but there are lots of others with different needs, and
I guess the power struggle. I mean, that's.
yeah.
Yeah.
I was.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's great to hear lots of voices, you know.
Yeah,
and
I don't know. I was
how have
wondering.
we encountered this? I mean, I think the only way to think about it is, you know, this is the concept for an exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, these are issues that we're struggling with on a daily basis, isn't it? So, in one sense, it would be you know, if I was teaching this in Australia, for instance, okay, I may have members of different Aboriginal communities, or different communities, different cultural communities, who may not necessarily feel that it was a hospitable environment in which to learn, okay, and B, that anything I was saying, or most of what I was saying, didn't touch their world in some way, that person's world. So what one would have to be is have the time to be hospitable to that viewpoint. Now, in practical terms, that is extremely difficult, because take certain Aboriginal forms of thinking and being, they take time. Okay, it may take 3 days to work out something, And you would sit there for 3 days to do it. Okay, so we wouldn't say, okay, it's 11 o'clock, coffee break time now, we have to do something else. Now, what kind of world would accommodate that? You know, certainly the world I was working, the educational world I was working in didn't, which meant that I very rarely got to encounter an Indigenous Australian in any classes I had. They were virtually invisible, okay? But also, I didn't go out either to find out where they were, why they weren't there, or, you know, okay? So in a sense, it's this kind of being with is a really, really profound shift. It's great in theory, it's great in an exhibition, okay? But when you take it into the world, it's incredibly difficult because, you know, as we say, the world is set up, you know, in terms of making money, time is money, production, consumption, you know, the capitalist model. So how do you operate within that?
Yeah. No. I just, you know, wanted to add that I think the kind of, you know, where does the ethical become political somehow, or, you know, or vice versa, in the classical sense of political. I mean, there are now a lot of, you know, different again definitions of political, you know,
But in one sense, I mean, that in that particular example, it is political because you say, hang on a minute, this structure isn't allowing this person to have an education if they want one. Or, you know, or maybe we are assuming that our education system or what our forms of knowledge are, you know, why are they predominant? Why aren't we going out to listen to, you know, other modes of knowing the world and thinking about the world? But I mean, and that would be a profound political change. You know, I mean, if we think about it in terms of art making in universities, we can't even get modules long enough. You know, the fight for the 40 credit module in which you've got time to make art. You know, it's you know, it's both at an absolutely minute level, and I put it to you that the minute levels are the most difficult levels at which to change things. Okay, so it's politics is not this big thing outside of us. It's like, how do I get a 40 credit module in which my students can make art? Okay, so.
Can you just explain what a 40 credit
yeah,
module means? Is
no,
that
it's a long. No, it isn't. It's not to do with actual time. It's to do with how much information you put in a. But it is to do with that. It's both. But if you have a 40 credit module, usually it goes across 2 semesters usually, or it can do. Yeah. Whereas if you have a 20 credit module, it goes across 1. But if you're in the studio trying to think your way through an art project, or trying to make a large sculpture in which you've got to fire things and then it's cast into bronze or whatever you're doing, you don't have time to do that. So it's geared up for making conceptual art where you don't need a studio, and the university doesn't have to pay for studio space in one sense. And lots of MAs don't have studios. But that's just one example, thinking from the position in which I encounter politics actually on a daily basis. Okay.
That discussion reminds me of the bit that you touched on about attention span. And I understood to an extent about what you were referring to in attention span, but what I was also thinking was there's different ways of learning, and that thing of going through the things in great detail strikes me that's back to what the Aboriginal thing of saying, let's talk about this for 3 days, or discuss this for 3 days. And how has it changed or hasn't changed, or what's the perceptions around that?
I've no idea now because I'm not in that environment. I don't know how that's changed. You know, it was just one very striking aspect of my experience there, which I hadn't encountered in a British university.
You go.
Okay. I just know from studying a little bit with some Aboriginal people in Australia that there is the resistance against the British or European conception of time as linear, that the resistance against that can be thought of in a political way, and that reasserting other conceptions of time for example, the dreaming, which is kind of ever present. That's an active, political thing for some people, and but also people have to participate in the economy and the political economy, so they sort of have to do both of these things. So
I think I wanted to say something.
Good.
I just wanted to comment on the issue from a New Zealand perspective. I grew up in New Zealand, so it's not directly related to art education. But in New Zealand, politically, there's this whole kind of bicultural kind of institutionalization, which I think is interesting, not that it's perfect or that it works, but that it makes time for these conversations. And so it just relates to what you were saying, Alison, because it's actually institutionalized this bicultural dialogue, which is based on the Māori Indigenous people of New Zealand, like a kind of marae system, where there's this type of format of meeting, and that actually, I haven't studied in New Zealand for 8 years, but that it actually has an impact into tertiary institutions. And for example, a friend of mine just recently attended the International Visual Methods Conference, which was held in Wellington in New Zealand. And so the opening of that conference would open with a pōwhiri, which is a Māori welcome, and would close with a pōwhiri. And so actually, it's quite, I'm trying to say, is that there is this kind of incorporation of another sense of time, and it is quite thorough throughout society, and it changes your academic experience. So it's just a contrast.
That's great. That's great to hear.
And while I've got this,
go for it.
I'm sorry, I missed the start of Sybil's comment because I was in the bathroom. But I'd just like to go back to the very opening of the essay.
Yeah, let's do that.
While we're at it.
While we're at it.
Because I think that it raises, that the whole story of the meteorite raises questions. And I don't know if I have a problem with it or not. But I think it is definitely a problematic, and it's written in the form of a problematic. So I would like to think about it further, and so I don't have like a single statement that I'd like to make about it, but I'd just like to raise some questions. One thing that I think is interesting is that it's a meteorite, and so it's an object or a piece of stuff that's fallen from the sky and has landed in this particular place where these people live, who happen to be Indigenous people, as far as I can tell from the story. I think it's interesting because in a way it's a kind of universal object, as in it's from the universe, and it now is located in an area of the earth that is populated by Indigenous people. And I think it's interesting because perhaps if it wasn't so heavy and so heavy, perhaps it would already be in a museum. But it's because of its physicality, it's remained in this location. But I think I'm interested in the kind of action or the movement, the displacement that was proposed, because there's when the text asks the questions about would perhaps the meteorite prefer to be in an art exhibition rather than a science museum, I think that's interesting because it assumes that if it was collected in a Western way, then it would be put in a science museum rather than an art exhibition. And this is the part where I don't really know what I'm saying. So
Well, just keep going and it might just emerge.
I suppose for me, I'm struggling to know at what point that's a kind of superimposition on what it is already according to where it is, because from the story, although it very generously mentions that there's these kind of indigenous claims or particular claims on the object for it to stay where it is, I don't have any sense of what that object is, where it is with those people now. And so for me, that's a story that isn't told here.
Okay.
Another thing that I was thinking of was, would it be possible to reverse this process? Like, where is the object now? And how feasible is it to bring something from Europe to this location? Because I think that raises questions to do with how the art world works, and would you get insurance to bring Michelangelo's David and place it where El Chaco now it is now? And what's the kind, if we're talking about displacement, is it really, like, is it a fair displacement? Because I'm not sure that it could work the other way around.
But yes, I mean, I'm sure it couldn't. I mean, it's kind of an asymmetrical question, though, isn't it, in a way? Because, I mean, it's an interesting question, because if Callan had said, okay, we'd like to swap, you know, Michelangelo's David in Florence for a period of 100 days, can we do a swap? You know, this is one of our sacred objects. You know, what would have happened then? But you're right, because it is, in a sense, I mean, you have to ask Carolyn, because I don't know the ins and outs of who the object belonged to, the meteorite. Who did it belong to in legal terms? Okay. And what was that negotiation? I mean, did it belong to the government? Did it belong to the people? You know, did it belong to the owner of the land? Who did it actually belong to? What was the question of ownership? Not just spiritual ownership, but legal ownership. Because those are the things that would have to have been negotiated in the same sense as they would with Michelangelo's David. The insurance costs, who owned it, if they're willing to lend it, all of those kinds of things. But they're different sets of negotiations, aren't they? Because they're different cultural sets of negotiations for a start. And they're many layered. So I don't think you can map one thing straight onto the other. However, your question raises really interesting practical considerations, which would then raise the cultural associations and the cultural claims, in a sense.
Because I suppose it makes me think of the issues to do with repatriation of objects, of Indigenous heads, for example, in the British Museum that are refused to return to New Zealand. So these. The other thing I'd like, so I've just got a whole lot of ideas, I'm just going to throw them out.
Good.
For example, and I think this is interesting because it is an object that fell from the sky and it's not been made by Indigenous people, and so the issue of ownership is all the more kind of perplexing. But for example, you can't leave New Zealand with mussel shells because they belong to the country. There are a lot of things that you cannot actually exit the airport with. And I mean, I know that to European friends that I've had, they've been to a restaurant, and in New Zealand we have very large green mussel shells and they're quite pretty. And you eat your meal, you have a lot of leftover mussel shells, and you think, well, these are very different to the small black ones in Europe. I would like to take them home with me, so you put them in your bag to take home. And you can't leave the country with them, and it seems ridiculous because actually the restaurant would have thrown them in the rubbish. But they are in this scenario, seeing as you're taking part of the country with you, and so I think it's actually, in a funny way, quite an interesting comparison, because you have this very large discrete object that you cannot actually shift,
Yeah.
and then you have this kind of fragmented bits of shells that somehow matter to a lot of people, that would be rubbish. So you've got this idea of this decomposition.
Yeah, but it stays in the country and goes back into the country's earth.
Yeah.
In a sense,
And
so it's the life cycle of an object staying in its home, in its original environment, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting question.
And you've also purchased them, and this is actually a true example from the restaurant.
Okay.
You've purchased them, and you could purchase mussel shells or something made with mussel shell from the airport that had been made, and not necessarily by Māori people, but
To take
all
away.
shells, which would leave from the airport would have been blessed.
I mean, that's so interesting, because then you get, the question of capitalism, the question of tourism, the question of cultural heritage, all these. It starts to raise all these questions. Just one thing while I'm thinking about it. I suppose when you were talking, what I was thinking of, the comparison with taking something to Argentina to swap it for the meteorite would have been Stonehenge.
Mm-hmm.
One of the stones from Stonehenge would have been a good swap, wouldn't it? To try, and if you were thinking about it in Britain, that's what that would be. That would be an equivalent that has the same kind of spiritual resonance, and there's no way you would get that out. It would, because to Indigenous Britons, it's so much part of the heritage that, Sorry, Brenda.
Yeah, and maybe as an add-on to complicate things further is if you really think this matter and issues that we discussed yesterday, to give agency to matter, to objects, it may be in the interest of the object to be actually taken away and go on travel rather than end up as rubbish.
Yes.
So
yes.
so you could counter a whole belief system or kind of
I think that's what she meant when Carolyn says, but what if the meteorite wanted to travel?
Exactly. Yeah.
What
if the mussels want to?
Yeah. What if the mussels want to travel? Because then you're giving agency. You're giving agency to the object.
But then maybe that need that Caroline feels for maybe from a Western or European point of view to de-center human agency, maybe that comes at a cost to different indigenous conceptions, because there are different views in here, which perhaps have already worked out a more inclusive worldview that encompasses agency of different species and
But in a sense, the indigenous community did hold out, or the representatives of.
Some of them did.
Some of them did.
Some of them.
Yeah, but it didn't get moved, is what I mean. It remained.
But Caroline also made a decision. Didn't she?
Caroline almost. Yeah. But.
Oh, I agree with Sybil. Actually, I'm quite interested in what we were reading yesterday as a way of challenging a Western idea of ecological responsibility.
Yes.
Because in parallel to that, I think that there are like indigenous knowledges and indigenous cultural systems that already do that. And I just think it's interesting that it's easier from a Western approach to approach science as this kind of molecular or quantum that it's positing a different reality, that we can believe that this actually works and we can respond to that as something true, whereas responding to indigenous knowledges and ecological responsibility embedded in non-Western systems is perhaps still mythological.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that it's easier to respond to science than to Indigenous knowledges that are caught up in mythological questions that are difficult.
I think that's probably, though, just to interrupt you, sorry, that's probably because it is our only starting point in one way. Where we have to start from we will always start from our culture because that's where we're embedded, okay, and that's where we feel confident with our knowledge. Okay, and so in one sense, but that's why I think Carolyn has started this essay with the meteorite as a problematic, as you quite rightly said, because it sets all this in motion. And I think, you know, it is no accident that both of you are speaking, both of you, one from Australia, one from New Zealand, who live side by side with Indigenous cultures and the legacy of colonialism, where this has to be thought out on a daily basis, you know, every day of your life. It's always there, it's always present. So I think it, and that for most of us isn't the case, okay, to the extent that it is for you. And we have all sorts of kind of multiculturalism, but in a sense, it's the foundation of your countries. You know, it's the foundation of your citizenship in one sense. You know, is the colonial experience and the remnants of that, the legacy of that, and then learning to learn, okay, from what was almost destroyed, okay, the remnants of what was almost destroyed. So I think, in a sense, to start Documenta with that gesture, with the meteorite, which actually is not of this earth. I mean, the interesting thing is that we're not even starting a Documenta with, you know, the earth that we live, our planet, right? We're starting a Documenta with an object from another planet, okay, or somewhere else. So already it begins with something that is not of us, is not of the earth from the very beginning.
But that's not necessarily not universal, a global perspective either,
No.
because Indigenous worldviews are cosmological.
Cosmological, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think it's certainly a big gesture, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, maybe we should.
Can I just say one
Yes, of
more
course.
thing?
Of course, go for it. While you've got the microphone. The Empire Strikes Back, yeah, go for it.
I just wanted to say that I think Carolyn mentions a conservative notion of patrimony, that cultural heritage is specifically mine and cannot be shared or merged in any way with that of others.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose I just wanted to make the point that although the meteorite didn't move, and so in a sense wasn't shared with the people that it had, that the proposal proposed it to be shared with, I think it would be wrong to, I think this is a different idea, and I think it would be wrong to think that because the meteorite was not displaced, it isn't shared, and that the people who were opposed to moving it were the people that didn't want something of theirs to be shared. Because I think, and that's what I'm saying, that from this kind of brief account, which is obviously not the whole story, and Carolyn talks about partiality, I don't have any sense of what those people's opposition was, and the way that they already it already is being shared where it is.
Yeah, I mean, through the very debate, you mean? Through the very, or do you mean there will be a cultural notion that this is a shared object per se in the world?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I think it would be interesting to go back through, go back on the internet through all the debates, because they are all there, and to pull this out. I think that would be really interesting to do. But thanks both of you, because that it's really great to get a different perspective, and you both, by virtue of where you live, have to deal with this all the time. So I think that's great. We do, but in different ways, I think. No, I mean, because it's such a big object, because it's this gross, heavy thing, okay, in one sense it raises the problem in a gross and a heavy way. Yeah, in a local way, yeah, I suppose. Oh, well, local and global, I think, but... Okay, so shall we push on? I think we're on page 34, the philosopher and scientist. Okay, so the philosopher and scientist, I don't know how this is pronounced, Vincente Desper, argues, I can't see this, it's so small, argues the net... The what? The rat, oh. Can somebody read this who's got better eyesight than me? The rat proposes to the student, yes.
As well as the student
Proposes to the rat.
Do you want to have the mic?
Thank you.
Do you want
Yeah, why don't you read it?
No, I want you to.
No, it's fine, you go for it.
The rat proposes to the student as well as the student proposes to the rat, a new manner of becoming together, which provides new identities. Rats giving to the students the chance of, quote, being a good experimenter, unquote. Students giving to their rats a chance to add new meanings to being with a human, a chance to disclose new forms of being together.
Okay. Any comments on that? No? Okay, she adds that trust is another form of love, and that the sense of trust enables the potential to become real. Okay, she adds that trust is another form of love, and that the sense of trust enables the potential to become real. One puts oneself in the position of openness, of belief, of passion. Could you continue with the quote for me, please? That would be great.
To depassionate knowledge does not give us a more objective world. It just gives us a world without us, and therefore without them. Lines are traced so fast. And as long as this world appears as a world we don't care for, it also becomes an impoverished world, a world of minds without bodies, of bodies without minds, bodies without hearts, expectations, interests, a world of enthusiastic automata observing strange and mute creatures. In other words, a poorly articulated and poorly articulating world.
That's a lovely way of putting it, isn't it? Thank you. Any comments on that? We push on to the end of the... So a worldly intra-action rather than inter-action. You leave it there and we'll pass it down if we need it. A worldly intra-action with materials, objects, other animals and their perceptions suggests forms of desymbolization and disowning knowledge and notions of property, as well as providing the possibilities of a slower form of time, the time of materials. This involves reconnecting people with their ancient knowledge of directly caring for their own sustenance and food, and severing that from the corporate production of food, which can dramatically disempower humans in ways not seen in the past 10,000 years, as well as forms of degrowth, alternatives to financial exchange, as in time banks or barter economies, establishing possibilities for relations and interactions with all things that are not digital, sharing artworks and objects from different places, times, objects that are not always filmic. Okay, so objects that are not always filmic. I mean, that's an interesting thing, because in one sense you could say that's film is a form of dematerialization if you don't think about the materiality of actually making it. Okay, which one used to do, I used to make 35 and 15 and 35mm film and Super 8 film. 35mm film with a great friend of mine who had the money to do that. But you used to actually splice the stuff together, so it was material. Okay, absolutely material. When you make a digital film, okay, you are dealing with machines, so you are dealing with an object, but the actual splicing together of sequences, okay, is done with zeros and noughts. It's done digitally. Okay, so you don't feel it anymore. I mean, you could actually count the frames and know how long a sequence was going to be. Okay, so in one sense, the world may have turned filmic. Well, it's turned digital now. But what that passage implies to me is what you just said about the local, okay? If the world has turned digital and filmic, if we're global in that sense, okay, if you're dealing with objects and things, you have to deal locally with things, okay? So in a sense, she's looking at two forms of circulation. I mean, I think we are actually in a moment of two forms of circulation. You know, the global circulation of information, and then attempts at the local circulation of food, labour, through time banks, through growing organic food, on a local level. And these two things are happening at the same time in different spheres. So I think that's really interesting. Yep, yep.
Just to be silly, I was wondering if anyone would have tried to buy Pierre Huyg's artwork with the bee.
With the honey, or the honey from it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because
I
it's
don't know, a good question to ask.
completely sort of against all those big art collectors who would be going to Documenta.
Yeah, and he's a big artist. You know, he's a big international artist. So that's a very interesting question to ask, actually. We'll ask Carolyn that when she gets back.